Rain is back and it's better than ever, or rather, should I say, it's better than nothing, which seems to be what we've been getting here for the past 2 or 3 months. I don't think we've measured more than 10 hundredths of an inch of rain since the end of August, maybe since before then. But it's been dry out there, so we are going to take any drop of moisture that we can get. I'm Luke Byers, and you are listening to Gab in the Cab. So there's a couple of reasons why I wanted to talk about the subject that I'm going to be touching on today. One of them is because it's been dumping rain outside today, and so I've got nothing better to do than sit inside and record podcast episodes. But the other side of it is that we have a federal election coming up next Tuesday, November 5th. Obviously, in my own capacity, I'm not permitted to endorse any particular candidate. But I can encourage you to exercise your civic privilege and responsibility to go out and vote and make your voice heard, and not just in this community, but around the country. But I want to touch on something that's been a big topic that's been brought up in the cycle of this particular election. And it's something that affects us all, whether you're a consumer or a producer, any end of the spectrum of the farm economy. And that's the idea of inflation. So we throw around this term of inflation a lot, and a lot of times, we simply associate it with rising prices. But a lot of times we don't take the time to consider where does inflation actually come from, and what are actually the long-term effects of inflation on things like not only your own personal pocketbook, but your own farm finances and how you're going to get a crop in the ground and raise it, bring it to harvest, and actually make some money on it. So that's some of the things I wanted to talk about today, some of the underlying principles behind it, and maybe some things that we can think about or do about it that are in our own individual control. So one of the fundamental misconceptions that I just touched on a second ago is the idea that inflation is synonymous with rising prices, but that's not actually necessarily completely true. Inflation is rising prices for a very specific reason. So, for example, you could have prices of a particular good rise as a result of a supply shock or a fear of a supply shock. This was the situation that we saw whenever we saw commodity prices just jump through the roof right after the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war in early 2022. That wasn't necessarily a result of inflation. That was because there was a growing sentiment and a reality that there would be a massive global shortage of particular grains and feedstocks coming out of the Ukraine European breadbasket region. And as a matter of fact, that came to fruition. Production from there was significantly down relative to expectations prior to the Russian invasion. And as a result of that, the shortened supply elevated those prices pretty dramatically. But that's not the same thing as inflation necessarily. In the same way, you could have a demand shock whenever there's a bubble in the economy. There might be a massive group of investors or individuals that are demanding a particular good or service higher than they were previously. And as a result of that, the scarcity created by that causes those prices to rise. But that's not necessarily the exact same thing as inflation. Inflation is whenever the prices of goods and services and inputs in the economy rise as a result of a decreased value of the dollar. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that there's a higher demand or a lower supply of a particular good or service, but rather that there are more dollars in the economy relative to the goods and services that are produced than there were before. You might be thinking, well, if there's more dollars in the economy, isn't that a good thing? I'd really love to have more dollars in my pocket. But one of the things that we have to remember is that the dollar itself, that green piece of paper, isn't worth anything by itself. Its worth comes from its connection to value that is created in the economy. And that value is represented in the dollar, but it's truly nested in those goods and services, whether that be grain, cattle, machinery, getting a haircut, literally anything that you can think of that is produced in the economy is represented in those dollars, but it's not the dollar bill itself that has the value. So what that means is if you have, a certain amount of production in the economy, and a certain amount of dollars, then each dollar is going to represent a certain value. But if you increase the amount of dollars, like green pieces of paper, in the economy, but you don't increase the amount of production, the goods and services that are produced, then suddenly every good and service is going to have a higher dollar uh, sticker price attached to it without necessarily it being worth more value. It's the same thing, it just has a higher dollar associated with it, which is why we hate seeing it going to the grocery store or when we're prepaying inputs or whatever the case may be. We think, why has the price gone up? It's not might not necessarily be because there's a supply shortage or a demand shock that everyone's demanding this particular item or product, but it could simply be that there are more dollars in the economy relative to the value of production that's been created. So, how does that happen? How do those dollars get there? Well, there's a couple of ways that those increased amount of dollars in the economy can show up there and result in inflation. One of them is the one that people most commonly think of is the government prints money. And yeah, this is true that the government does print money. And sometimes it uses the printed money in order to finance some of its policy initiatives. And what that does is if those dollars are not necessarily attached to goods and services or production that's produced in the economy, it basically gets spread out across all those goods and services and causes everything to have a slightly larger sticker price. So that example is kind of simple to wrap your head around. Okay, same amount of stuff, government prints money, more dollars. That means for each item, there's higher dollar amount. But what are some of the other ways that inflation can be created through an increased dollar amount? How do that increased amount of dollars get in the economy? Well, one of them is this concept that we call money creation. And it's not as if individuals or businesses can literally create money or literally create dollar bills in the same way that the government might be able to print money. But the idea of money creation is basically saying that you can have the same amount of value nested in dollars spread out across multiple locations. So I'll use an example of going to your local bank. So if you go to your local bank and you put a deposit in, the bank will then use that deposit to make a loan to somebody else. So if you were to go to the bank at any given time, they're not going to have all of everyone's deposits there. In fact, 80-90% of the deposits that people put into the bank are going to be lent out to other people in the form of loans, which is why bank runs are such a big a risk that we experienced during the Great Depression, whenever there was a massive run on the banks as a result of the stock market crash. People really wanted to get their deposits back. Well, the banks didn't have their deposits because they were all out in the form of loans. So you look at your bank account and it says, okay, I have this many dollars in there. That's true. That's your property. Those are your funds. But those same funds are also out to your neighbor in the form of a loan. And so that's basically how that money is being created across multiple locations, even though it's the same value that's being represented in those dollar bills. Now, it's important to utilize things like loans because that's how we help to liquidate or liquefy, rather, I should say, investments in future production. So you take out a loan today, you buy a piece of property, or you take out a line of credit or an operating note. Why? So that you can produce more agricultural production through grain or livestock or whatever, in the anticipation that that investment is going to pay off. You're going to be able to repay the note, repay the loan, and have more value generated as a result of it. So if we think about that kind of example of money creation, quote unquote, via financial intermediaries creating money by having the same value spread out over multiple locations, both to you as a depositor and to your neighbor as a borrower, and that's creating economic growth in the economy. That kind of helps us to think about why we might think of something about interest rates being something to be used as a control on something like inflation. So you might be hearing the news, oh, the Federal Reserve is going to increase the interest rate or they're going to decrease the interest rate. And what that basically means is that the Federal Reserve is using tools at its disposal to tamp down inflation by making it less desirable for people to spread out that value over more and more places. And so, what that's intended to do is slow down the increase in the amount of those dollars, and as a result of that, slow down inflation. But before I go any further, I should probably back up a second and talk about what is the Federal Reserve and how does it actually do that. So the Federal Reserve is basically it's a financial institution that exists at the federal governmental level. Now, its officers are independent of the executive branch per se. They don't take orders from the president or anything like that. But they are nested within the United States government and are part of the overall federal system. And the way that they help to regulate things like the interest rate, or really to regulate things like inflation, are altering what is called the prime interest rate. And the prime interest rate is basically what is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve uses to loan to large financial intermediaries, big national or international banks throughout the United States, who in turn might loan to smaller banks, what we might call bankers' banks. Um, and eventually down to individuals, to businesses that take out those loans for the purposes of investments. So, all that considered, whenever the Federal Reserve increases those interest rates, those bankers' banks are less likely to take out those loans or to finance their own operations, and then it trickles down the chain. And as a result of that, you have lower overall borrowing, lower overall reinvesting, lower overall spreading out of that value across more and more dollars. One question that we might ask about this whole situation, though, is why is it that in just the past 3 or 4 years, inflation got so much worse than it was in the previous decade or 2 decades or 3 decades or 4 decades prior to that? So there's two main theories that I'd like to discuss whenever it comes to explaining why inflation might have gotten worse just in the past 3 or 4 years. One of them is the more traditional notion in the monetary theory of inflation that basically talks about the supply of money relative to the supply of goods and services produced in the economy. The other one is called the fiscal theory of inflation, and it was developed by Dr. John Cochrane of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And what the fiscal theory of inflation basically says is that it's not simply the money supply versus the supply of goods and services. It's also what is the public's confidence that a major debtor like the United States government is going to repay its debts. It's kind of similar to whenever you're watching either stock markets or commodity markets go up and down, not because there's necessarily a supply shock or demand shock or anything like that, but because there is an expectation of a shock in the market. So if we expect that a particular country's regime is going to go down in flames, well, then it's very possible that the stock of a multinational company based out of that country is going to plummet even before the event itself happens. And so the same idea follows here. We could say, oh, we, the public, we, the economy, anticipate that the government is not going to repay its $35 trillion in debt that it owes. Therefore, the dollars that it has essentially invested into the economy, it's not going to be getting a return on those $35 trillion. It's essentially going to be lost. And so the $35 trillion is no longer connected to actual value that's been created. It's simply inflationary. And so if the perception of the public is that that's not going to get repaid, there's not going to be a return on that, that itself is a cause of inflation. And so that's what this theory says. We are coming out of a period of time that is prior to these interest rate hikes that we saw in the recent past of what we might consider easy credit. So easy credit is basically a euphemism for saying that it was really easy to take out a loan from a financial institution and use that in the form of investment towards increasing production in the future. Now, if you're able to repay all those loans, over time, eventually that value recovers itself. But the challenge with that is if everyone or a large proportion of individuals are taking out loans, whether it be farms or private businesses or whatever, are taking out loans for investment, that's a lot of additional dollars that are quote unquote created simultaneously because it's relatively inexpensive to get that money, to get those dollars to make those investments. The higher the interest rate goes, the harder, the less desirable it is for individuals and businesses to take out those kinds of loans because there's a lot higher quantity of dollars that they're going to have to repay, that their investment is going to have to give them on top of the principal in order to make their investments worthwhile, in order to make their loans worthwhile. I suspect that the sources of inflation are multifarious in nature, where on the one hand, you've got money creation, basically the monetary theory of inflation, where money creation is causing inflation because easy credit, where credit was offered to individuals at a rate that was lower than the rate of inflation. Therefore, it was essentially cheaper for you to take out a loan than to pay something in cash because the interest rate that you were paying would be less than the inflation that you were experiencing. So that's something that we were able to put a stopper on. The Federal Reserve put a stopper on by increasing the prime rate above the rate of inflation and bringing the rate of inflation down as a result of that. But the other side of it is it only works as a long-term solution if you're also reducing the amount of government spending that is taking place in the economy relative to the goods and services that are going to be produced as a result of that government spending. So now we come down to a question of policy. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, if excessive government spending just makes everybody's life worse and makes nobody's life better, then why do we keep doing it? Well, a lot of it comes down to, I think, the general public's misunderstanding of how inflation is caused and also a misunderstanding of what the government's role is in making individuals' lives better. Whenever a policy comes out that includes a massive spending bill, the theme, the rhetoric behind it is always, well, it's to help out the little guy. It's to help out the little, small time economic actors to help bring them up out of destitute or at least relatively undesirable economic circumstances and help them stand on their own 2 feet. And while this is all great sentiment and great themes and great rhetoric, at the end of the day, one has to ask, is that actually what's taking place as a result of that particular policy? And that's something that we can see if we just go to the bank and ask to take out a loan. So if I go to the bank and ask to take out a loan, what is the bank going to do? Well, they're going to basically not just do a credit analysis, but they're going to do a collateral analysis. And basically, they're going to analyze whether or not I'm going to make good on the loan. They're going to analyze whether or not the value that I create as a result of receiving that loan is going to exceed the dollar amount of that loan. And if it is, then over time, there's going to be a greater increase in value relative to the creation, the short-term creation of dollars that was created by the loan. But if we're $35 trillion of debt, as I keep alluding to, that's a major indication that the value that has been recouped in the economy does not exceed that. And so it essentially begs a question: has federal policy on spending ultimately been a cascade of poor investments? Now, this is a difficult needle to thread because on the one hand, it could be easy to say all government spending is bad because it creates inflation and it has a historic track record of not recouping the value that it purports to create as a result of those investments. But on the other hand, there's a lot of times where investments, and that's essentially what government spending is purported to be, is investments in the American people. It ultimately sometimes comes down to the individual that's receiving the benefits from those government spending. So a lot of sources of government spending that we can think about might be things like Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid, crop insurance, Title I commodity programs that we talked about last week. If you're getting $45 or $50 an acre for a failed soybean crop or a failed corn crop, that's government spending. And so the question is, wait a minute, I'm receiving $50 an acre for my corn crop. I didn't produce the corn crop that I was expected to produce. The value that I traditionally create in a year in the economy was not there, but I still got money. But here's the thing: the point of that is, from a policy perspective, it's supposed to help the American farmer. But from the farmer's perspective, it's really meant to help reinvest in the future and prevent people from exiting the agricultural market, from the agricultural industry, simply because of one bad year or multiple bad years. And so, in that way, it is an investment. And the way that we, as agriculturalists in America, make good on that is by using the investment that those farm bill programs put into us, put them back into the economy and make good on it the next year or in the following years. So financial stewardship is a major component of making sure that we're doing our part to make sure that inflation doesn't get exacerbated. The reason that someone at the bank gives you an operating note is because they believe that the value of production that you're going to create throughout the course of the growing season is going to exceed the value of the dollar amount of the loan that you took out from the bank. And so that's the bank investing in you, the farmer. And same way with those programs, it can be construed that the American policy on agriculture is investing in the American farmer. So that's kind of how we thread the needle in that regard. It's not necessarily that crop insurance is a bad investment or that Title I commodity programs are bad investments. It's ultimately up to you, the farmer, to determine whether or not it's going to be a bad investment. But it's also safe to say that since we are $35 trillion in debt, guess what? Some of the investments, quote unquote, that the government has made in the United States of America have not necessarily paid off. And that's a big problem because what that means is that the dollars that are pumped into the economy don't match up with the value of goods and services that are created in the economy. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves in response to that is twofold. One, what am I doing to basically manage my assets on my operation to best position myself to, realize a higher value relative to what I was experiencing in the past? The other one is how am I doing my part to stem the tide of adverse economic circumstances that pervade the industry that I belong to? And I'll address the second one first because it's a really complicated question. So what I'm really getting at is first we have to address the underlying sentiment that we in agriculture are price takers or we just deal with whatever comes our way. And to a certain extent, that's true. Whenever you go to the elevator, the price is the price, and you take it or leave it unless you've done some other marketing strategies. But even so, there's a range that you have to operate in. You can't necessarily say, go to the elevator and say, I want $8 for my corn, or you can't have it because, that, exactly what I'm saying. So that's one side of it. Yeah, we do have to do it. The same way with the weather. We got a great rain today, but that's following 2 months of not a drop, and that's something where it's not as if we have the opportunity to say, well, I don't like this, so I'm going to change it. I mean, you could take it up with the man upstairs, but that's um, that's one side of it. Yeah, we do have to take things at face value and manage for them, manage the risks incumbent on the industry as a result of those factors that are endemic to our industry. On the other side of it, the question that I'm addressing specifically here is, what are we doing to make sure that we are a good investment for individuals that may be investing in us outside of our control? Because it's really easy to get small-minded and laser focused and self-interested in this area and say, well, I'm looking out for number one. And sure, irrational self-interest is one of the major driving forces of the U.S. economy. But the question that I would implore people to ask themselves is, whenever someone's making an investment in me, whether it's a bank or the government or anyone in between, uh, am I making good on that investment? We do this with our kids. Whenever we send our kids to college, and if we've given them assistance by paying for their tuition or their room and board or whatever the case may be, well, the anticipation is that they're going to receive a quality education, and as a result of that, have a good career for themselves and make a name for themselves and develop a good reputation and have good character and be a good citizen. We're investing in our children every day. And ultimately, what we want our children to be asking themselves the question, am I a good investment? Are my parents or the people who take care of me, is their investment in vain? Am I making a good return on it? So that's the question. If we want to lead by example, we have to ask ourselves: is am I a good investment? So, uh, and a lot of times that'll bear fruit in its own time. And there's no one out there that says, "Well, I want to be a poor investment for somebody else." But it's easy for us to sometimes get lackadaisical about how we perceive that kind of activity that's taking on, and rather than seeing this rampant government spending that might take the form of a government or a crop insurance indemnity or a Title I commodity program, we might regard that as an entitlement, but ultimately it's an investment, because if it's an entitlement, it's inflationary. If it's an investment, it has the opportunity to either be inflationary or help the economy grow, and only you can make that happen. The government can't make that happen. Only you can make that happen. And that's one of the things that I wanted to make sure that I brought to the forefront of our discussion. So that's the second question, and the first question is more of a practical, less of a deep down in your soul question. But it's basically a question of, how am I organizing my assets? So we can look at our own balance sheets and say, okay, well, I've got a bunch of cash because I have this operating note. Sure, but cash is subject to inflation. Plus, if it's a loan, it's doubly subject to inflation because A, it's subject to inflation in the economy, and B, it's subject to interest repayment. And that is taken into account in the bank's collateral analysis. So if you have the loan, chances are that you're regarded as a good investment by the bank. But that's also something you have to keep in mind. You don't just want to be a good investment to the bank in the sense that you're going to cover all your costs. We don't want to cover our costs. We want to make money. And if you're in farming, you're in it because you love it, and you know that you're not going to make money every year. But if you're not expanding, you're also contracting. So that's another side of it that we want to take into consideration. So how are we balancing the liquidity, the relative liquidity of our assets? And whenever I say liquidity, that's just a fancy term for saying, how easily can I get my assets to be converted into cash? And the higher the illiquidity, the higher the resilience to inflation. The lower the liquidity, the more susceptibility to inflation, but also the easier to access. So that's, these are all big picture things to keep in mind. Just making sure that you're keeping your assets organized in such a way to make them resilient to inflation, so that in the future, maybe not this year or next year, but in the long term, you're able to withstand the current of inflation as it ebbs and flows throughout various administrations in the U.S. economy, and also so that you can make plans for future generations. So those are two things to consider, and big picture questions of, how am I making sure that I myself am a good investment? How am I making sure my farm is a good investment? The second one is, how am I making sure that my farm is going to be a good investment in the future, not just today? If you have questions about organizing your assets to be resilient to inflation, or just making sure that your farm operation is financially sound and is moving in the right direction, that's what we're here to do at the River Valley Extension District. It's basically partner with you to help you address the individual needs of your family farms. We're not here to teach you anything. We're just here to partner with you to make sure that you have all the resources and time and energy to get all the things that you need to get done. So if you'd like to reach out to us, we have locations in Belleville, Clay Center, Concordia, or Washington, in Clay, Cloud Republic, and Washington counties. If you'd like to reach out to me directly, I'm at the Clay Center Extension Office, 785-632-5335, or by email at lsbyers, B-Y-E-R-S, at ksu.edu. Thanks for listening to Gab in the Cab. We'll see you next time.